Okay, good afternoon. Thank you for joining us today for a lunch talk with Tana Wojczuk, who is author of a new biography of the great 19th century American actress, Charlotte Cushman. My name is Matthew Wittmann, and I am the curator of the Harvard Theatre Collection and also your host today on this rather soggy Cambridge afternoon. I am coming to you live from an empty reading room in Widener Library at Harvard University. As some of our viewers are no doubt aware, Houghton Library is presently undergoing a renovation, which should be completed early in the new year, and we look forward to announcing a date for reopening the library in the spring. In the meantime, we are taking the opportunity to host some virtual events like our talk today. A few bits of housekeeping on that before we begin. Please note that this talk will be recorded and made available online in the days after the event. In terms of the format, after my introduction, Tana is going to talk about her book and some of the specific material she found about Charlotte Cushman at Houghton Library. We had asked attendees upon registration for questions and/or things they were particularly curious about. And so in the second part of today's event, I will ask Tana some questions compiled from these responses. And then finally, we will open it up to live questions from our attendees today. You will note that there's a Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, so please type your questions there. And if you see something already asked that you also want addressed, there is a means for you to vote on other people's submissions. Tana Wojczuk is a writer and teacher from Boulder, Colorado. She is a senior nonfiction editor at Guernica and has an MFA in nonfiction from Columbia University, where she also formerly taught. Tana presently teaches writing at New York University and is here today to discuss her debut biography, Lady Romeo, which is of course about Charlotte Cushman, who was born not so far from where I sit here today on July 23rd, 1816 in Boston. There's much more that could be said about Charlotte's fascinating story, but I don't want to step on anyone's toes. So with that brief note, I will turn the floor over to her.
Great, thank you, Matthew. It's nice to be here virtually and to have been able to be at the Houghton in person to do a good amount of the research for this book. So today I'm going to be focusing on a brief introduction to the book and an excerpt that focuses on Charlotte in one of her signature roles of Romeo. So who was Charlotte Cushman? She anticipated, you know, at the end of her life, the same kind of question being asked. What can be the record of an actress, however famous, she asked in her memoir. And part of the reason I began researching Cushman in the first place was that Cushman was incredibly famous in her own time. She was a household name, and yet we don't know about her today. And part of that erasure is due to theater itself, as Charlotte understood. A friend of mine once compared it to Michelangelo's snowman, and it has this beauty and this ephemeral quality, and then you leave the theater and you only remember bits and pieces. But it's also, you know, as you'll see from this talk and as you'll see in the book, it's also much more complicated than that. So let's just start with who was Charlotte Cushman to the people of her time. So this is a daguerreotype of Cushman from the Houghton Library. I think she has a really incredible expression here. And here's some quotes from famous people who knew her and from the New York Times in 1876. So Walt Whitman writes, when he was a theater critic for the Brooklyn Daily Eagle in 1846, she seems to identify herself so completely with the character she is playing, a genius. In 1858, Louisa May Alcott wrote in her diary, saw Charlotte Cushman and had a stage-struck fit. And Alcott, in fact, considered giving up writing and going on the stage after seeing Cushman, but her family talked her out of it. And at the end of Cushman's life, in an obituary, the New York Times wrote, there was hardly a hearthstone among the English-speaking families of the world where her name was not a household word. So Cushman was at this nexus of celebrity culture, the burgeoning celebrity culture in the mid and late 19th century. And when she was born in 1816, America was still struggling to declare itself as having a culture. And some European traveler said that America is basically a cultural backwater and it's a nation of campers. So Cushman, along with her contemporaries like Wittmann and Emerson and Longfellow and later Alcott, were all struggling to define what that American culture could and would be. And so she was arriving on the scene at a really important moment in American history. So some of the people that she had contact with included Abraham Lincoln, who was a big fan of hers, and she was good friends with William Seward. Lincoln famously saw her perform during the Civil War in a benefit for the Union, and was really bowled over by her performance. And one of the correspondents whose work I found at the Houghton Library that I just want to touch on briefly is Longfellow. So here's a lovely mutton chopped image of Longfellow. I love this one. And just one of the 5 letters from Cushman to Longfellow that are in the Houghton collection. Just a couple of small details from this. She addresses it, dear friend. Previous letters were addressed to dear Mr. Longfellow, and in this one she's asking a favor. So very characteristically of Cushman, she really adjusts her rhetoric depending on what she's trying to get out of the person who she's writing to. She was quite savvy at that. But it is a very friendly letter. And she asks him if she can have an artist stop by to make a sketch of him for her personal collection. And ends by talking about making an appointment to see each other soon. All right, so this was one of my favorite pieces of sort of artifacts of Cushman that are in the Houghton collection. It's very rare to come across actual theatrical ephemera from Cushman that are physical objects. And this is a dagger that was said to be given to Cushman by the famous British actor William Macready, who Cushman had a falling out with. And I in some ways wonder whether this was an apology. And the theatrical superstition is that stage daggers never go dull, but I suppose that's because they're never actually used. And I wanted to stop and focus on this for a minute because the dagger was given to Cushman and she wore it during a performance of Romeo. And Romeo was one of her major roles and the one that made her famous abroad. And an interesting note about Macready is when Cushman first played with him in America, she was terrified. She wrote in a letter and also in her memoir that she was very, very terrified because he was such a giant. And in fact, he performed in one of the very first theatrical productions she ever saw as a young girl. And she took, his thoughts on acting to heart, and he advised her that if she really wanted to be truly famous, she would go to London and try to be a success there, because Americans would never accept her as an American actress until she was big in Europe. And so she took his advice to heart and she saved up her money and she traveled to Europe. And one of the first shows that she did in Europe was as Romeo with her sister, Susan Cushman as Juliet. So this was a pretty savvy move also on Cushman's part. So Cushman was a young actress. She was not particularly, famous at all abroad, although she had some success in America. And she had played Romeo with Susan a little bit in America, but doing it in Europe was considered a risk. And her manager initially didn't want her to do it, but she decided to do it anyway. And it was a huge smash. And it was actually a very exciting event because it allowed her to make passionate love to Juliet on stage in a way that was considered culturally acceptable. Audiences could view this as passionate love between two women. They could view it as being between a man and a woman. They could look at Cushman and say, well, she can't really be that passionate because it's her sister. So there were all these ways that this performance equivocated and spoke to different audiences in different ways. It was, as I said, a huge success, and there was a Staffordshire figurine made of the pair of them that was widely distributed, produced around 1852. So this propelled Cushman to fame and made her Romeo sort of the talk of the town, and Queen Victoria came to see her Romeo as well. And one of the biggest debates that this this portrayal sparked was about the performance of gender. Although it wasn't spoken about in the exact same terms, audiences really were debating how well did she play a man? What did it mean to be a man? Let's go to that one later. So I wanted to just take a minute to zoom in and read an excerpt from the book where Cushman is playing Romeo with Susan in London for the first time. So we're gonna dive into the book here. This is in chapter 10. Casting Susan as Juliet had been Charlotte's idea. And Maddox agreed. Maddox is her theatrical manager, despite his skepticism. Susan was pretty and feminine with large greenish brown eyes and dark brown hair. She wore parted in the center like her sister. She was shorter and slimmer than Charlotte, and her time at the Park Theatre made her into a fine walking lady. She was a kind of jack of all trades. The idea of two sisters playing Romeo and Juliet was a novel one. In another twist, Charlotte also demanded that they work with the full text of the play, rather than the vulgarized version from David Garrick that had been in fashion for decades. In the Garrick version, Juliet wakes before Romeo dies, and the lovers are given, quote, a mess of dialogue from Garrick's own pen, which one critic wrote, the best epithet for is balderdash. Charlotte, an American, insisted on a purity and fidelity to the original that Shakespeare no longer enjoyed in his own land. At the time, it was a controversial choice. Other actors in the production, quote, expressed in no uncertain terms the difficulty the original text was giving them. They saw Charlotte as a pushy American and considered the restoration of Shakespeare's text not in terms of purity, but as a regression to something they called, quote, primitive. While Charlotte and Susan rehearsed, their fellow actors complained about them behind their backs, deriding them as, quote, American Indians. But Charlotte continued to insist that they perform the play as written, even if that meant the whole company of actors would have to memorize new lines. In the end, she got her way. The controversy over the production and the unusual pairing of two sisters in the lead roles made for a good story, and on opening night, the theater was packed. As a gesture of goodwill, William Macready sent Charlotte a dagger from one of his own performances with a note of encouragement. Before taking the stage on opening night, she slid the dagger into its sheath and belted it around her waist. In her dressing room, she pulled on tall boots and smoothed her tunic of gold velvet. She had cut her hair short and curled it so it fell in boyish waves around her ears. Susan was costumed in a tight-waisted, bare-shouldered dress of bridal white. Love is a smoke, Romeo declares at the start of the play, a troubled sea nourished with lovers' tears. Though Garrick's version cut out Romeo's love affair with a girl named Rosaline, Charlotte had it restored for a reason. In Romeo's first lines, Charlotte, quote, disclosed that ardent, passionate disposition that waited but for the opportunity to break forth with irresistible violence, so that the first scenes contained the whole possibility of the tragedy, and critics approved of this choice. Just as a sidebar, one of my big interests in writing this was looking at Cushman as a kind of dramaturge and the ways that she reinstated lines from Shakespeare's original plays and performed them that give us commentary on the text. This is a good example of that. And the British audience also appreciated this take. They appreciated her clear enunciation of Shakespeare's lines and her lack of a strong American accent. She had learned to speak well, growing up among upper-class New Englanders, and could pass for someone high class. She had perfected the effect by copying Macready's accent. In fact, wrote one jokester, she even looked a bit like him. This is a quote from a little bit of doggerel that was printed in the newspaper. The bend of the knee, slight sneer of the lip, the frown on the forehead, the hand on the hip, in the chin, in the voice, 'tis the same to a tittle. Miss Cushman is Mr. Macready in little. Charlotte was a convincing swordsman. She dueled like someone to the manner born. During a fight scene with Tybalt, Charlotte hit her opponent's sword so hard that his weapon went flying downstage toward the audience. The pit erupted in cheers. One critic wrote, Miss Cushman is the one person we have seen who can handle a sword in stage combat so as not to make the encounter seem ridiculously prearranged, and at the same time give the affray the appearance of reality without savageness. Her passion for Juliet also gave the appearance of reality, though with her sister as her co-star, she was protected from further salacious gossip. Women found her Romeo an ideal lover, impulsive, sensitive, courageous, and cavalier. This sentiment was put best by an anonymous female fan. Charlotte Cushman is a very dangerous young man. Men, too, were moved by Charlotte's Romeo. Audiences were used to seeing plays that emphasized men's capacity for savagery, but she showed them something new. When Charlotte discovered Juliet dead in a tomb, she did not merely hold the cold, dead hand as others did. She crushed Juliet in her arms and wept freely. As Romeo, Charlotte revealed emotions men were not supposed to express in public. Her Romeo even made critics uncharacteristically self-reflective. The character of Romeo is one in which every man of sentiment takes to himself and estimates according to his own feelings and impulses, wrote one observer. Perhaps a more intellectual and more theatrically effective performance has never been witnessed, enthused another. Both men and women met her with flowers at the stage door. Actors were sometimes criticized for making points or for playing just for the big scenes, which made the story seem disconnected and artificial. But Charlotte, as the Times of London wrote, gave the play, quote, the vivifying spark whereby the fragments are knit together and become an organized entity. It was this coherence, Coleridge claimed, that characterized the best interpretations of Shakespeare. She clearly saw Romeo, quote, as an impetuous youth whose whole soul is absorbed into one strong emotion and whose lips must speak with the inspiration of his heart, not as merely a fine speechmaker or maudlin stage lover. In her hands, he was, as another critic wrote, a creative, living, breathing, ardent human being. A few, however, were furious that Charlotte would try to, quote, ape a man on stage. Women had played Romeo before, but the goal was to titillate men in the audience who enjoyed seeing a pretty actress in a short tunic. Charlotte, however, acted like a man rather than a woman in tights. Besting men at swordplay. Then when her chivalric Romeo collapsed weeping in the final scene, she gave men in the audience the dangerous impression it was okay to do the same. A controversy broke out in the press and between audiences and critics. Charlotte might split the ears of the groundlings, wrote one of these critics, referring to the working class audience who cheered Charlotte on from the pit, but he still believed she was nothing but a male impersonator. Eventually, even Queen Victoria weighed in. The young queen declared that while Charlotte entered well into the character of Romeo, no one would have ever imagined her a woman, her figure and voice being so masculine. The one thing everyone agreed on was that Charlotte made a convincing man. The performance was complete. When a joker in the audience faked a sneeze during one of Charlotte's love scenes, she stopped the performance. Most actors would have ignored it, but Charlotte, still in character, led Juliet off stage, quote, as a cavalier might lead a lady from a place where an insult had been offered to her, then returned to the stage and commanded, some man must put that person out or I shall be obliged to do it myself. The offender was lifted up by the crowd and carried away. The audience rose en masse and gave 3 cheers for Miss Cushman, who then went off stage to retrieve Juliet and continued the play as though nothing had happened. She had swagger, or what Italians call spracciatura, can't quite say it, a kind of studied nonchalance. As Romeo, she walked like a man, spoke like a man, moved her body with the confidence of someone used to taking up space. The most manly thing about her was her sense of freedom. In fact, some argued she was a better man than most men. Her love speeches had a poetic cadence that they argued no male actor could achieve. Alternately, the chivalric cavalier and the tender lover, she was perfect in each. One reviewer declared her Romeo one of the most remarkable pieces of acting ever witnessed. Another wrote that after seeing Charlotte Cushman, lovemaking as practiced by the other sex would seem a very stale, flat, and unprofitable affair. Okay. All right, so here we are. Here's Cushman. And here's some of the other women she played Romeo to offstage. She was known to sign her love letters to her female partners, "Your Romeo," and she was a Romeo. She had many different female partners. Although at the end of her life, she had lived with Emma Stebbins, the sculptress, for several decades. So they were certainly committed to one another. Although that didn't stop Cushman from also having an affair with a young actress named Emma Crowe, who later married Charlotte's nephew and became Charlotte's daughter-in-law by all accounts. Here are a couple of different women that Charlotte was in serious relationships with. The first being Matilda Hayes, who is the English translator of George Sand. And they tended to dress alike. When Elizabeth Barrett Browning met them at a party in Paris, which this never made it into the book. It's one of the things I wish that had. There was actually, they were on a balcony, and below them in Paris, Napoleon III was retaking Paris by force in a military coup. So there's quite a dramatic backdrop and violent backdrop to this. But when Browning met them, she wrote to her sister that they dress alike, they go everywhere together, they must be married. And she was a little bit shocked by this, but her sister wrote her back that she ought to be more urbane, and that this was in fact quite common. And then we have on the right, or my right, Emma Stebbins, who is the sculptor of the Bethesda Fountain Angel in New York Central Park. And Stebbins came from a Boston family of long lineage, and she and Cushman met in Rome, where Cushman had created a kind of artist commune of female artists, sculptors, writers, who occasionally all lived together and had relationships with one another, but also supported each other's work and boosted each other as artists. Right, and that brings us back to the book. So I'm looking forward to taking questions and hearing people's thoughts about Charlotte and her work, and filling in any additional gaps.
Okay, as I said, we had some questions that were submitted by registrants beforehand. There was a lot of interest in sort of Cushman's sexuality, or how Cushman may or may not have expressed her sexuality. A lot of the questions recognized how we tend to think of something like Boston marriages, to use the locution that's local to us, as asexual, as kind of spinster partners. And people also recognize that in the 19th century, women often had more expressive and romantic relationships without necessarily being quote unquote lesbian in the modern sense. So basically we're curious, a lot of people were curious about to what extent we can know about her sexuality and how she expressed it. On that note, did she ever have relationships with men? What do you believe the terms of her relationships were with her assorted romantic partners? Yeah,
so it's a good question. I think this term Boston marriage, at least in the way that Henry James thought about it, has to be taken in context. James was very critical of women who seemed too masculine, and he wrote of Charlotte Cushman and her group of women sculptors in Rome that they were a white Marmorian flock, which meant that they were like too staid and marble-like, and but he also couldn't get in. I mean, there's also a little bit of sour grapes happening here, I think. Henry James also wrote that he remembered when he was a kid playing in this little circle of light with his brother, and his parents came in. It was intermission during a show of Charlotte Cushman's uptown, and they raced down to grab one of them and grabbed his brother instead of him and took him to the show. And he felt like his brother's sense of the world had been widened, and he was still stuck in this little circle of light. And he later recalled seeing Cushman perform and really seeing that it was incredible. So thinking about her in terms of that term Boston marriages is kind of interesting, because I think from the outside, that is exactly how these relationships look to people. They looked staid, they looked celibate, they did not look particularly passionate. And if you look at the published record of newspaper articles and public-facing documents, that's the narrative that you see. But this narrative has been challenged. I saw it in my own research, and it's also been challenged by other scholars who focus more on primary documents and letters between women. There is ample passion in these letters, and it's not simply like Victorian purple prose. They're very tender, they're very specific about what they miss about each other. Cushman wrote to her, what I would consider her first love, the painter Rosalie Sully, I miss your lips. I miss the touch of your lips on my cheek. I miss putting my head in your lap. And these aren't just girlish expressions. They're quite passionate and specific, and followed by lots of exclamation points. And she's deeply sick with longing for Rosalie when she first travels to London and is away from her. And there's a sense of physical longing that is very evident in these letters. I think that they wrote, privately also about other aspects of their relationships that were very much like a marriage, working on, household duties together and figuring out how they were going to live and where they were going to live. But I think that I think it's more of a leap, an imaginative leap, to think that they weren't having sex than to think that they were. I think it requires quite a lot of mental math to look at these private documents and these love letters and think, oh, but they weren't actually sexual or they weren't physical. We don't know. We don't have diaries like Anne Lister's that are like really graphic. Those are unique and very special. But Charlotte wrote very passionate letters about wanting to be physically with and kissing and being with her lovers. So I think she was certainly a lesbian. I think people have also asked about her if she would have been, trans in some way. And I don't really know the answer to that, because the language, she wasn't using that language at the time. But I also think it is interesting to look at her letters and see she often refers to herself as a man, not only as Romeo, but the man of the house, and took on that role both on and off stage, and was very comfortable in that role.
Great, thank you. And apropos of a question that was just asked in the Q&A, the next one is my attempt to combine some questions we had about Charlotte Cushman's understanding of race in the 19th century. Specifically, there was a question about Edmonia Lewis, who was a sculptor of mixed Native American and African American heritage that Cushman encountered and supported in Rome as part of that expatriate circle. And then also there is Sally Mercer, who was an African American maid and lady in waiting to Charlotte Cushman that she took with her, I think, on her first trip to London when Sally Mercer was 14 years old, and stayed with Cushman through her death and was viewed as a member of the family, et cetera. At any rate, Cushman circulated with abolitionists. As you noted, she came back during the Civil War to do benefit performances for Union soldiers, et cetera. But what is your sense of what we can deduce about Cushman's sensitivity about race in the 19th century via her actions with these people in her life like Edmonia Lewis and Sally Mercer?
Yeah, I think so. I think it's a good example of where you want to find something and you just don't find it. I went into the research really, hoping to find some direct statements by her in letters about her beliefs and her feelings about slavery. She was a passionate admirer of Lincoln. She believed him the most thoughtful, sensitive, deeply engaged person that she had met. So we do know that. We also know that she was very close friends with Thomas Wentworth Higginson, who was a fervent abolitionist and also later an editor of Emily Dickinson's work, as a side note, and went to these parties where the topic of abolition was lively and always being debated, particularly also in her London circles that she circulated in. But that doesn't mean she was an abolitionist. I think if the question is did she use her platform as a celebrity and a public figure to speak explicitly for abolition? She did not. Did she raise money for the Union and support the war effort? She did. She traveled actually twice to America to raise money for the Union. And, during a time of war, traveled into the war to raise that money. But she didn't speak publicly on this, just as she didn't speak publicly about her relationships with women either. Edmonia Lewis was an important definitely an important sculptor and an important figure who deserves her own biography. I hope someone's working on that. But as far as I know, she was part of Cushman's circle. And Cushman, Lisa Merrill, who wrote another book about Cushman that focuses on her relationships with women, called When Romeo Was a Woman, writes that Cushman raised money and gave loans to sculptors, including Edmonia Lewis. But that's the extent that I can find in terms of her support of Lewis's career. Sally Mercer is more complicated. As you said, she was a part of the family. She started working for Cushman. She was born a free Black woman. She wasn't born a woman, a young woman, and she could read and write. She was very smart, and there are a lot of letters from Cushman to her with these extremely detailed instructions and things that she needed. And we know that Sally took care of a lot of Cushman's costumes and worked with her as a prompter to practice. And Sally, in the couple of letters that survive from Sally, she talks about Cushman as a beloved. I mean, that she said, we all sheltered under her angel's wings. And she received a lot of condolence letters after Cushman's death, which also suggests that people, outside of Cushman's own family saw her as part of the family. That said, Sally was her employee. She did start working for her when she was very young, and Cushman took her away from her family. They took turns on the ship, sort of supporting each other while they were throwing up and feeling horrible, miserable in the ship. And they lived together throughout Cushman's entire career. So there was no one who was with Charlotte more than Sally. And I know also that Charlotte didn't like to be alone and relied on the people around her for emotional and moral support as well. So that's what we can say. What I can infer is that she and Sally were close, but there was a power dynamic that was always there. And Sally did receive an inheritance when Cushman died and lived at the house that Cushman and Stebbins bought in Newport, I believe until her death, although I'm not sure.
Okay, the next question concerns celebrity, and it's straightforward. How would you compare Charlotte Cushman's celebrity then to current day celebrity, particularly the pressure to perform in public in purportedly off-duty moments? Was she always quote unquote on? Does Charlotte Cushman have a sharp divide between her private and public persona?
Yes. So in this book, I claim that Charlotte was really the first American celebrity. And the reason that I claim that is because she went beyond being simply famous for being an actress. She was famous as a public figure and was followed by the press after her success in London pretty constantly. I remember there's a newspaper article about her in Sault Ste. Marie where she had gone for vacation and she went out riding in men's clothes. And of course, this was reported in the newspaper. When she was diagnosed with breast cancer and underwent one of many surgeries, these were also reported on in the newspaper. And she was in Europe and in Scotland getting surgeries, and the American newspapers were reporting on her health and how things were going. So she crossed, she blurred the line between sort of having a public and a private life. I would say that she did have a very strong sense of always being observed, always being on. She did like to go for solitary walks occasionally. And in fact, that is possibly what finally killed her. She got pneumonia on one of these final solitary walks, but in Boston. But she was a private person, but she also knew that she always had to have her face on, in a sense. She was really good at copying other people's mannerisms. She was an excellent mimic, even when she was a child. She got in trouble for copying the priest's mannerisms at the breakfast table. And so my sense is also that she was able to take on different personas pretty easily, also in public. She, however, in her letters, she doesn't write a lot about that. It doesn't seem like she's consciously like thinking about how am I gonna look when I am going on vacation or doing these things. She's much more concerned with her career, and she really wanted to be judged solely by her career. And in fact, that's why she asked for her private letters to be burned. She didn't want to be remembered for her private life. So, I'm working against her wishes in some respects because we want to know everything. But thankfully those letters weren't all burned. So we do still have some of those.
Okay, well, I'm going to fast forward a question because we had a question about that. The book is filled with people burning letters to and from Charlotte Cushman. And so, as a librarian, I'm just wondering if you could tell us a bit about what survives, how it came to survive of her correspondence. I mean, one of the interesting things at our library is that there is a lot of outgoing Charlotte Cushman correspondence because we're based in Boston and she was friendly with Sumner, Longfellow, et cetera. So our collection is sprinkled with letters from her, but again, these are sort of, public relationships about, kind of everyday matters of calling on people, et cetera. Although I guess she was calling on Longfellow to make a portrait that's a little bit more personal. But in any case, could you talk a bit about the burning of letters and what survives?
Yeah, so the biggest collection of private letters is between Charlotte Cushman and Emma Crow, who later became Emma Crow Cushman, 19-year-old actress who Charlotte met in America during a tour, and when she had been together with Emma Stubbins for a long time, and they fell in love and had, Charlotte invited Emma Crow to come be with her in Rome, and eventually Emma married Charlotte's adopted son, Ned, and became part of the family. And so they were very deeply connected and in love and emotionally dependent on each other, but often far apart. So the fortunate result of their separation is all these letters. Charlotte asked Emma multiple times to burn this letter and to burn her letters, which Emma ignored. As far as I know, I don't know, maybe some were burned, but they were ignored. And we have these letters and it's incredible. So Emma Crow Cushman saved a remarkable number of letters from Charlotte. And so the bulk of the existing Charlotte private correspondence is in the Library of Congress in the Charlotte Cushman papers. But the limitation of that is that it's all within a very specific time period when she had pretty much retired from acting. It's the latter sort of part of her life. And they're about personal matters. They're about the household and the domestic sphere and her personal relationships. So these are incredibly valuable to researchers. But it's also, as I said, not how Cushman wanted to be remembered. And also, I think it's very important with someone so accomplished to also look at her career and how, what were her business dealings? I think this is actually very important to see how she negotiated. A lot of the letters at the Houghton, you can see her as a really crack negotiator. And she was really standing up for herself and knew the ins and outs of her world. She was a businesswoman. She knows who she wants to perform with. She's very strategic in her thinking. And she's a networker. So once you start bringing in the material like that, where she's corresponding with Whittier and other people, you see that she's this node around whom a lot of people are circling. And she is connecting people. She's making these connections for her artist friends to get commissions and get them money and get them grants. And she's using her power in this very savvy way. So, in terms of the value of these, they have to be all taken together.
Okay, thanks. Just two more of the prepared questions. The first one is pretty direct. Is there any truth to Cushman, that Charlotte Cushman is the model for the angel on the Bethesda fountain, which you've already alluded to, but which Emma Stebbins received the commission for?
Right. Let's see here. Hold on. Had another image of that just to pull that up. So yeah, I think that's a great question. So I spent a lot of time with this sculpture, both in person and this way. And Cushman and Emma Stebbins were together when Emma Stebbins was making this sculpture. She helped Stebbins get this commission, as did Stebbins' brother. And Charlotte was visiting Stebbins' studio almost daily during the creation of this sculpture. And it really strongly resembles Cushman's body. It's very powerful. It's got very broad shoulders. I would say the head, not so much. It doesn't look like Cushman at all, but the body resembles her a lot. And critics responded to this statue in very much the same way they responded to Cushman herself. When it was unveiled, they thought it was too masculine, too powerful, and really wrote about it in the same language that they used to talk about her body. So I think there's strong evidence that she was the inspiration for this. And regardless, I think that there needs to be better acknowledgement of who Emma Stebbins was and who Charlotte Cushman was on Poets Walk in Central Park. You walk down Poets Walk and it's all men, and then you have this statue, but there's nothing that tells you anything about, it's really about its provenance in that way. So it remains a kind of secret history, but I think it needs to be better recognized sort of publicly. Yeah, so it's an interesting landmark because it resembles both. It shows us a lot about what is unseen or sort of covertly being referenced sort of in our landmarks, which is a major issue, I think. I'm gonna stop that screen.
Okay, thanks. And then one last prepared question, which is, Charlotte, how did Charlotte Cushman separate herself from more typical and existing what are called breeches roles? I think it's an important distinction in so much that there was a long history of women playing male roles in the theater, but yet Cushman seems to have done something a bit different in her career. And also it's pretty clear, obviously, from the quotes you've already given about her role of Romeo, that it's a bit different than pre-existing ones that tended to be pretty women playing male parts, or the emphasis generically was on pretty women playing male parts. And as you remark upon at length in the book, Charlotte Cushman's sort of aesthetic beauty was not always appreciated, or it was remarked upon in her public performances. So she's not playing a traditional breeches role. Like, what is your sense of what she's doing that breaks with this tradition?
Yeah, so yeah, she was called Epicene, which is like neither man nor woman, which kind of means similar things. She was called a pantheress, pythonic, I think is one term. So we get a sense that her body is very strong, very lithe. She was very tall for her time period. She was as tall as most men at 5'7". So we have a sense of her as being masculine in the sense of being powerful and having a strong physique, and also taking up a lot of space on the stage, and domineering over her male actors. There were definitely some actors who did not want to work with her because she was too domineering, and they thought it made them look weak. George Vandenhoff, Edwin Forrest. Edwin Forrest liked to be the man on stage. He did not really like performing with Cushman. And she didn't just restrict herself to playing characters like Viola and Rosalind, who she did play, who were women, dressing as men, but very soon took on male roles themselves. And her approach was, I think in part because she was seen as masculine and as a more convincing man, perhaps. It wasn't seen as a leg show. And the audience for her breeches parts seemed very different. It's really an interesting moment for the theater because more women are coming into the theater. So at the beginning of her career, it was primarily men in the theater. Women were really not allowed to come unaccompanied. Later on, there were matinee performances created specifically so that women could come midday and be part of the theatrical audience. And women were a huge part of her fan base. As I said, she had to also woo mostly male theater critics, but women also were taking over that space. there was an explosion of the periodical press at this time, and more women were writing for it and writing theater criticism. So they found her incredibly sexy. They found her masculine, but they also found her, as I said, like an ideal lover, very tender and very sensitive at the same time, and sort of combined these different characteristics. So I think she did something really unique. And also I think she was able to direct her performances at many different audiences, but in particular to women who were wooed by her.
Thanks. So looking at the Q&A, it looks like those questions on some level had already been addressed by you about Edmonia Lewis and Sally Mercer. So I'll just ask another of my own, which was, could you expound a bit on the relationship between Lincoln and Cushman? As you said, it was quite warm, but there's some passages in the book where you discuss their interactions via William Seward, who also she was very close to.
Yeah, so Charlotte Cushman stayed with Seward when she performed in Washington, D.C. The Seward House was also like a center for social gatherings and things like that. And so she was able to see a lot of people. And when she came to America she traveled from Rome to London and then came to America for a benefit performance for the Union. She stayed with the Sewards, and Lincoln came every night while she was there. And Fanny Seward, William Seward's daughter, wrote in her diary that she would see Cushman with all of the men in the sitting room talking politics late into the night. And she thought that was really amazing and really admired her, and that she really held her own and was witty and informed and actually passed along. I have some letters where she passes along political information, for example, warning William Seward about one of his political rivals who's is out to get him. So she was not only, in the room with men, she was actively engaged in these conversations and networking and passing along information. So before this, she'd met Lincoln once before, and Lincoln had made her promise to play Lady Macbeth for him. Those of you who know Lincoln and Shakespeare know that he was a huge fan of Macbeth. He called it his favorite play, and he grilled actors about their work with Shakespeare when he got the chance. He preferred to read Shakespeare, but as we know, he loved going to the theater as well. And he found in Macbeth a way to think through the question of ambition and sort of what the limits of ambition should be, and the way that it could haunt you. And the time when she came to do this benefit performance, she also did a performance shortly after that Lincoln attended. And she did do her Lady Macbeth, which was one of her most famous roles. And this was the same time that Lincoln is writing the Gettysburg Address. And if I could have been a fly on the wall in one of her performances, this would definitely have been it, because I would have loved to see his face as he's watching her. I know a lot about that performance and what she might have been doing, but what he took from that. But I do know that he saw her, very powerfully, not like dabbing at the blood or like anxious, but like trying to wring this blood from her hands. And knowing that he had the blood of so many young men on his own hands, which he wrote about. And he's in the process at this time of writing the Gettysburg Address, commemorating those fallen soldiers and, the blood that consecrates the ground at Gettysburg. So it's a really powerful moment where all these things are coming together, and what he's seeing on stage is really resonating with the things that he is thinking about and writing. We know he's thinking about them because he's written about these things. So I think that relationship of artist and spectator is really powerful as well. And it shows the way that an actor and an artist can have can create a space where we can think about these things that otherwise we might not be able to deal with or to handle. But I also find it really interesting that he wanted to be in the room with her. He wanted to talk to her. She was a very witty conversationalist, Thomas Wentworth Higginson, this is a weirdly misogynistic comment, but I'm going to say it because it's about her as a conversationalist. He called her such a witty conversationalist that after having created Charlotte Cushman, America can be pardoned for 500,000 half-alive women, which is like, whatever, Thomas. But he was taken with her. So, but over and over again, you see in people's letters about Cushman, she was incredible. She was funny. She performed. She did all the voices. She was really on in these conversations. And Lincoln wanted to be around her. I think it's hard to know. We don't know what they talked about, but given that this was like at the height of the Civil War or the depth of the Civil War, we do know that they would have been talking about politics and abolition and the war, certainly. I do wish she had been in a position, or I wish she had thought she was in a position to speak on these things publicly. As far as I know, she didn't. And I know that she was very careful about her public statements. She really only talked about her roles or about her family and her Puritan sort of ancestors. So I think that was a moment where her private life was too separate from her public life, from my contemporary perspective.
Thanks. So there's a live question on this that ties into what you just talked about some of the female roles she was known for. Obviously, we've talked a lot about her as Romeo, et cetera. You addressed there Lady Macbeth, one of her more notable roles, but could you talk about a bit about some of the female roles she was known for? And is your sense that she preferred it one way or another? Like if she had the choice of playing a play, like what was her go-to? Do you have a sense if she liked playing men, or that was something she thought helped her career, or et cetera? Like how do you feel the gender of the roles she chose shook out?
Oh, it's hard to say what she preferred because it was so advantageous for her to play these male roles. And she was quite ambitious, so it's hard to separate. But she wore men's clothes on and off the stage. She called herself, as I said, a man in her letters. My sense is that she was much more comfortable in that role. She took over the running of her household very early. She was the primary breadwinner for her mom and her siblings. And then later was consciously in Rome became the head of house for all of these female artists and supported a lot of them financially. And I think in terms of the sort of like what to her were the like meaningful characteristics of what made a good person, they were all at that time considered very masculine characteristics. She did not as much tend to value other parts of herself, which her friends valued, which that she was very caring. She was a good friend. She didn't talk about that about herself as something that she particularly cared about. So she did play women, both female and male roles. Her biggest successes were as Romeo, as Hamlet. She also played other male roles like Macbeth and Cardinal Wolsey, but she also had enormous success as Lady Macbeth. What's funny about her Lady Macbeth, though, is that it's a very, what at the time was considered masculine character portrayal. And Lady Macbeth was said to like bully her husband. George Vandenhoff said that he was afraid she was going to hit him. He said that to a newspaper reporter. And the most, I'd say, traditionally feminine role that she was really a success at was her portrayal of Queen Catherine, which she took on late in life. And Queen Catherine is also about a woman who is being shunted aside because of her age. And I think Charlotte taking that character on as she aged herself was very meaningful to her, and also very savvy, because she could complain about why it's so terrible that older women are being shunted aside simply because of their age. And her Queen Catherine was very celebrated. I would say, though, that mostly she kept returning to Romeo and to Lady Macbeth. And when she had the opportunity to dictate, for example, what she was going to do in that benefit, she certainly chose Lady Macbeth.
Thanks. Another question from the live chat is just about the sort of vagaries of Charlotte Cushman and the collective memory. And you talk a little bit about this in the book, and obviously you've talked about Lisa Merrill's book, which is now, to be fair, almost 20 years old, about Cushman. But the sense was that, you know, in the 1960s, that you wouldn't have necessarily known about Charlotte Cushman, and, you know, whether she, well, she is still, I would presume, outside of theater circles, not well known now. There is a lot more interest in her and people like her. And obviously, as you know, indicate throughout the book, I mean, she was incredibly famous in her own time. And so I guess this might be, I'll preview this might be a good ending question for you, is like, how would you explain or account for, you know, the knowledge of Charlotte Cushman, interest in Charlotte Cushman, and, you know, how did you actually come to this project on your own?
Great. Yeah, I think that, so accounting for the interest and accounting for the disappearance are two different things, but, you know, accounting for the disappearance, I think, is partly the, as you said, the sort of ephemeral nature of theater, and the way we remember it is really dependent on sort of these stage pictures that stay in our minds, not so much the entirety of the experience and how it was created. But, you know, Cushman also died when there was a very powerful shift culturally. The Victorian biographers, who would have been the ones to write about her, did not want to write about her. She, as a masculine appearing woman who lived with other women and was not known to have any romantic relationships with men, they didn't want to write it. They didn't want to touch her. And so she was written about later on, after the turn of the century, but the people who would have been there to interview, to talk to people who had seen her performances, to gather that material, did not do it. So we're left with like these memoirs here and there, where people were like, when they wrote their memoirs at the end of their lives, they would recall having seen Charlotte Cushman perform as like one of the highlights of their lives. So it's a shame we don't have more detail about what they saw. In terms of the interest and renewed interest, I think that there are so many reasons to be interested in her. She helped create American culture. She was a really important part of that moment where America was deciding what it was going to be and how it was going to present a public face, you know, to the world, compete with Europe, on what terms it was going to compete with Europe. You know, were we going to be big and brash like Edwin Forrest, or were we going to contribute something different, which Charlotte thought it should be something more. But I also think, you know, personally too, I'm interested in knowing like who the people were who got written out, who are such an essential part of our culture, because otherwise we don't really understand our culture. But I also think that there's more conversation about gender as a performance now publicly, and we're thinking of gender more in terms of that, and not as something innate, but as something created. And that's certainly something I was excited about. And not so much was gender still performative in the 19th century, because I think it's very clearly yes, that it's always been performative, but was it recognized as performative in the 19th century? And I think in researching this book, I saw again and again that yes, it was absolutely recognized as performative within the theater. I would say outside of the theater, maybe not so much, but the theater is this very special space where critics could say, she performed being a man very, very well. And it's cool to see them separate being a man and playing a man. And I think that to me feels very fresh and an exciting way to think about that part of our history.
Great. Well, thanks so much. This was just the most perfect timing. So thanks for that answer to the final question. As we're almost at the hour mark, I'm going to regretfully bring things to an end. Thank you all for joining us today. Please subscribe to our newsletter, Happenings at Houghton, or check out the library website for more information about future events. Thank you, Tana. Thank you everyone for coming, and take care. Bye.
Bye, thank you.